There we go. Okay. So, this is to get input from the community on next BGP work. I think one thing we want to do as far as IDR is we want to take new work, now that we're doing new work in BGP, and if you want to hear a sob story, come see me about that later. Excuse me, now that we're doing new standardization BGP work, we've been doing BGP work all along, we're trying to take it in order of ISP needs. I know this is a ops focus, but that's what we're trying to do. Is Yakov and I are trying to take new work, and the working group is trying to take new work in that order. So I want to talk about some new work that's being proposed and voted on, which are prefix limits, multiple TCP sessions, avoid transition, and we're all trying to get more and better stable BGP. Okay? So why am I giving this work? We need your input. We're at some decision points where even the co-authors say, well, gee, we'd really like to have the ISPs tell us what they need. So let me start with what I'll call VPN isolation work items. And by the way, my thanks to all the ISP people who talked to me last time. I'll probably continue to ask what's the next thing we should pick up, because we've got a lot of drafts and a lot of things we could put in, but if they're not useful today, tomorrow, I got some prioritization there, like toward the bottom of the pile instead of at the top. So the first one is a maximum prefix draft, which I'll go into. There are two alternatives being presented. Warning, here one of them is a group that I'm working with, which is Hares, Mir Fang, and the second one is done by my good friends K.R. Patel, John Scudder, and Chandra. We've got a real good discussion going on the list if you've been listening on the IDR list, but we've decided we really, really need NANOG feedback. The second one is a multi-sessions attributes or multiple TCPs. John Scudder and Chandra also came up with a good draft. It's been accepted and will be going forward in standardization. Am I too loud right now? Okay. And the next one is the avoid transition, how to get through the BGP decision process and avoid swapping for stupid reasons. There you got my free unwanted stuff. Again, I apologize, I just didn't take time to kill everything. And the last one is soft notify. Now, soft notify has been rejected at this point as far as there's not enough interest to go forward. Whether revisions of this draft or pieces may go forward later, I don't want to say that, just the draft in its current form. So, again, disclaimer, I'm a co-author on the maximum prefix draft, and I've asked some people to keep me honest, to make sure to complain where I don't, and I'm using my best understanding of the drafts. And again, other draft authors should come up and say things. So first of all, what's our maximum prefix problem? Well, today, in my understanding of ISPs, and it may be limited, they set the maximum prefix limit on a PE in a PE-CE environment that you see. And the warning may be sent from the PE to the provider's network management when the warning threshold is triggered. Now, these are configured triggers that say, you're within 10% of running out of the limit. At that point, the session will either be dropped by a PE when you hit a magic prefix limit, or the routes will be silently dropped. As a result, my understanding from the service providers is the NOC runs a fire drill and tries to get the limits changed and make sure the guy doesn't, or the CE customer doesn't have any connectivity lack. So there are two types of failures behind this. Just a little over the limit. I had 2,000 as my limit and I went to 2002. Ooh, that hurt. The second is, and I hear this occurs regularly, somebody drops a full routing table down the wrong pipe, and suddenly you have lots and lots of bad routes. That's a real problem. Now, the issues about it are you get a customer service interruption, you have complexity, and you get possible finger pointing. Okay, how do we deal with it today? Well, you could just not use the prefix limit and have infinite source. But some people really want to have lots and lots of VPNs on a single box for to make their business balance, so they need the prefix limit. Is there something that would make the customer's life easier? And again, now I'm going to put on my co-author hat. My co-authors who are service providers said, I want 3 limits. I want a warning limit. You know, that's going to give me a case where I don't have to have a fire drill. I get 1 to 2 weeks to say, you know, I got a creeping address problem, and I can go fix my limits at that point. The second, step back here. Some people were all talking in the maximum prefix draft about negotiated limits. The discussion has been lively. The first question I'll get to in a few minutes has been no negotiation on limits. So I'll go on to that in a moment, but I do want to say one of the options is, you know, none of this should be in BGP protocol, it should all be in configuration. But I want to go on and talk about these limits and then go on to the mechanisms. The second is ignore the prefix. Mostly that's the silent drop right now, okay, to give a limit at a certain point on the NOC pieces. And the last is drop the connection. And this is mostly targeted, from what I understand, to catch the erroneous blaster routes and get it stopped, because it happens so frequently. So we need input, you know, from service providers. Is this useful for your network? Is it crucial? Do we need to signal limits, or do you want to continue with configuration? The service providers that I was co-authoring with said, I really would like to signal this in BGP to the remote side and negotiate it, as well as have it configured, because obviously the changes would happen based on the NOC changing something based on a configuration. And do you think the suggestion of using this would break your network? And that's true of all these drafts. I should take a step back. On the maximum prefix draft, do you want 3 limits? Do you think 1's sufficient? Do you want no negotiation? Okay, the drop limit and the warning limit can be done locally in the other draft. In the draft by Patel, Scudder, and Apana. If I killed that, Chandra, I'm sorry. Okay, so let's drop into mechanisms, okay? If you look at the mechanisms and how they might actually end up, the 2 drafts, one specifies ORF, which will allow you to set the limit based on a particular prefix. And of course, 0/0 could be all prefixes. You could have that sort of thing. So once you get there, then it's the encoding of 2 different types of mechanisms inside BGP. You have the route refresh mechanism, and you have the dynamic capabilities mechanism. I think as you go through the top of the mechanisms, you'll recognize them from existing drafts, where you have in the dynamic capabilities, the action, the code, the capability link, the type of caps. In the route refresh, you have the AFI, SAFI. When is the route refresh enacted? Is it deferred or is it immediate? And the ORF type. In the base form, if we just have 1 limit, you'll see that there are 2 different forms of the same thing, a prefix limit for everything of about 4 bytes. The S in the dynamic capabilities or draft is, does this stop or does this go on? But if you add the 3 limits, okay, we had 2 different encodings of these, the -00 encoding, which had a bit flag, and then someone asked us to try the 4-byte align version. So in that, you would have the 4 types of limits. So in that case, the mechanism varies simply by the limits. Okay, what about operations on these maximum prefix limits? In the one that has dynamic capabilities, you first negotiate the limits in the open, and then you can renegotiate the limits with the dynamic capabilities. You have, in the dynamic capabilities, you send the dynamic packet, the action, and the prefix, and the other side can also send it. One thing I do note is in the dynamic capabilities, we may have an issue. In the dynamic capabilities really doesn't have an acknowledgement, and it might be useful to have that. That might be enhancement to dynamic capabilities. There are some known other issues concerning dynamic capabilities, whether you can do it in other forms, and again, missing this particular, I sent you dynamic capabilities, tell me you got it. If you look at the maximum prefix versus route refresh, you will have route refresh with defer. It will just send the other piece. Route refresh with immediate will ask for the route refresh info back. Now, there are some cases in here where I don't, I think I'll stop at that point and go forward. So one thing we really need to hear from service providers is, do you want just configured limits? Because there are a group of people who say, well, configured limits are really what we want. Forget the signaling. Why do you need signaling? You're going to configure it either way. The service provider said, that's great, but it's like a belt and suspenders. I'd like to have the configured limits. I'd like to also tell the remote side that I'd have these configured limits and let them know, and when I renegotiate it, I'd like to tell them. Now, this is not a chair's hat, this is a co-author's moment. I note the one reason I gave credence to this is the statistics from the Yankee Group and the Infonetics on how many outages and how much time is based on configuration errors. I denote also from NextHop we have a significant amount of configuration errors. So when the service providers I was talking to said, oh gee, I want something that checks my configuration, I said, I can sort of see that, you know. Configurations aren't perfect. It doesn't mean they're not a good service provider. In fact, I think it's because these guys are trying to be proactive, really, really focused engineers, because they're not going to wait for the customer. They're trying to be proactive. They're trying to focus on this. The second was you'd rather have this on an ORF basis or dynamic capabilities. That's a mechanism. Okay? And I laud the other co-authors' drafts. It was a really good draft to think through things. Okay, there's more details in the draft, but this is the question. I think the real point is, do you want this mechanism? And then we can discuss, do you want these 3 limits? Do you want 1 limit? Do you want none of this? We'd really like to have input. We'd like to also have input if you have preferences between ORF and dynamic capabilities. Okay. That's one big piece. Now let me go on to the multi-session. This has been accepted as a work item, and today we run different AFI-SAFIs over different sessions, but we do that today with multiple loopbacks and lots of configuration. But again, maybe we'd like to do this with a little bit more mechanism and and not as much configuration. So we want one passive peer to listen to remote peers' AFI-SAFIs and pick one. And then there's a multi-session capability, a GBIC, to pick the group. There's also 3 new error codes to support this capability. I don't have a support for that AFI-SAFI. There's a group conflict, or there's group required for this. Okay, I'm going to go on to the next draft in the draft list. Why BGP avoidance? BGP avoidance is identifier is allocated by the operator of the AS. This can be subject to change in the random numbers. It's become a 32-bit random AS number. Now, in the last 2 things, if anybody's seen some of my slides, what's really exciting as you get to the end of the BGP route selection is you start going with things like the BGP identifier or the router ID. And, you know, excuse me, the router address. So, you know, it gets to be a little comparison. There are some implementations which go beyond that and go to the age of the particular route. That makes it even more exciting. But this causes some stability. If you watched some of the other presentations that have had instability, you'll see that that has been listed. So this draft says, well, guys, when it hurts, let's just stop. You know, if there's a better old path and a new path based on the complete route selection, and they're both valid, and you're going to swap between the 2 of these based on something at the far end of this, let's not and say we did, okay? I suppose that, so there are exceptions. It can't be from a path from AS peer, and it can't apply the algorithm to parallel BGP sessions. So, where do we want feedback? We really, you know, if this sounds like I'm begging for feedback, you got it. It would be really good for all of us, because there are people who can't be here, to have you send a note to idr@itf.org. Or I'm sure the other reflectors will forward it on. That's where the mail list is being hosted right now. If you're shy, come talk to me. You know, I'm glad to hear anything. If you want to just tell me how terrible it is, still glad to hear it. At the break, at the beer and gear, I'll talk to anybody. I'm going to be hanging around, usually at the back of the room or in the front of the room, one or the other. You'll find me. Send it to Yakov if you don't want to talk to me. Send it to Alex. Alex, stand up someplace. You promised me you'd be here. Alex is the routing AD. Please, you know, if you can't talk to either Yakov and I, talk to Alex. Talk to the co-authors. We just need your help. And there's another one. Hey, Bill. So Bill is back there. Talk to the routing ADs. We're really trying to make this operator input determines our next steps and our milestones. I know it's unusual in some cases for ITF working groups, but we're really trying to stay focused.